Hey, today I'm going to talk about lenses. I get a lot of questions about what lenses I use in my videos, and I just thought I'd give some practical advice on the lenses I choose and why I choose them. First of all, I use two main cameras right now. I've got the Sony a6300 and the Sony a7S II. The lens that stays on my a6300 most of the time is the 10 to 18 millimeter Sony APS-C lens. It's ultra wide. I use it on the a6300 a lot because I'm often going for that sort of photojournalistic, in your face, wide angle, up close kind of look. Also, because this camera shoots 4K, I can shoot with a wide lens and then crop it in a bit in post and then output my video to 1080p and have it still be perfectly sharp. So it's kind of my safe lens. If I don't know how wide I need to be, at least I know I can get as wide as necessary with this one. Why would I use that versus the full frame equivalent, which is the 16 to 35 f4? Well, they have different functions for me. I use the gimbal a lot, first of all. A 3-axis gimbal. Beholder EC1 is a popular one. Zhiyun Crane is a popular one. There's a bunch of these. The lighter your overall rig is, the easier it is to hold for long periods of time. So this ultralight wide-angle lens is really practical, especially when paired with a mirrorless body that's also lightweight. But sometimes I want to shoot in lower light. Sometimes I want more bokeh when I am on the gimbal. And for those purposes, the 16-35 is more practical. At 35 millimeters at f4, I can actually throw the background quite a bit out of focus when I'm closer to my subject. With this lens, I can't quite do that, even if I'm zoomed in and get closer to my subject. There's definitely a difference, especially because this one zooms in a bit more than this one. Almost all my lenses are Sony, and you may ask, why do I use Sony lenses so much? Why don't I adapt other lenses, since you can adapt almost any lens to the Sony E-mount format? Well, the main reason is because image stabilization and autofocus are the best on native lenses. On Canon lenses, on Nikon lenses, yeah, you can adapt them, but generally you'll probably lose your autofocus or it won't work very well, and you may lose image stabilization depending on the lens. Also, the lens gets longer if you put the adapter on, so it's bigger for no good reason, and sometimes these adapters don't work so well. I had a Canon 24-105 that I put on my Sony with the Metabones adapter, and the lens only worked about half the time. Sometimes I'd turn on the camera and the lens just wouldn't register and I wouldn't be able to shoot. And I'd have to take the lens off and put it back on, take it off, put it back on, and then I'd be able to shoot. So to make my life simpler, I just go with the native lenses. Next, I'm going to talk about the Sony 28mm f2 lens. It's small, super small. It covers the full frame despite having an f2 aperture. It's super wide aperture. So I can kind of get close to my subject and throw the background out of focus and get a nice sort of medium shot. But at the same time, if I want, I can go wider and I can make it almost a wide angle lens. The thing it doesn't have is built-in image stabilization. Next up, we've got the 50mm f1.4 Nikon AIS lens here and the 35mm f1.8 Sony lens, which with the crop factor becomes effectively the same focal length. So these are both 50mm full frame equivalent lenses. They have very different uses for me. This 50 f1.4 is my go-to bokeh lens. If I want to throw the background out of focus, if I'm shooting something that's romantic in nature, if I'm trying to create something dreamy. It's also a vintage lens, so I get a little bit of a lower contrast, sort of softer look to it. So generally, if I want to flatter the subject and I want to throw the background out of focus, I use this 50 1.4. This has a very different function. I got the 35 f1.8 almost exclusively to use on a gimbal when I want to do a shot that has shallow depth of field. It has image stabilization. I can use the autofocus of the a6300 with face recognition, and I can track my subject as they walk and have good bokeh in the background. I can't do the same thing exactly with this lens because there's no autofocus. I can use the in-body stabilization of the camera to help steady out the shot, but if the subject comes closer to me or further away, my only option is to hand crank this or use a follow focus of some kind, which I don't want to do. So for handheld work, for flattering the subject, for creamy backgrounds, I use this one. For gimbal work, for tracking the subject with the focus, I use this one. Here's a lens I rarely use, but I used to use all the time. It's the Rokinon 35mm T1.5, aka f1.4 Cine lens. It's a big, long lens that doesn't have stabilization and doesn't have autofocus, but has a really wide aperture. It's pretty similar in look, actually, to the 50 f1.4. It has the same aperture. It's just a little wider, but it's so huge, it takes up a lot of my bag. So I generally don't bring it with me. The only time I would use this lens is if I needed to be a little bit further from my subject, yet still throw the background out of focus. An example would be if I'm shooting somebody in like an airplane cabin, on a bus seat, sitting across from me at a small table in a small restaurant, and I don't want to have to go all the way back to the wall to get my shot. I can stay at a comfortable distance with this and still get really nice bokeh in the background. Next up, we've got the Sony 50mm f1.8 OSS lens. This is a cheap lens. It's like, I think $250 US. It's effectively a 75mm lens on full frame, which means this is a telephoto lens. This is a portrait lens. If I'm filming somebody's face and I want to keep them in focus with the autofocus and I want to use the image stabilization to keep the shot steadier, I'll use this lens instead of something like my 50 f1.4 on the full frame, because this one doesn't have autofocus. Also, gimbals, very practical in a gimbal. With the A6300, if your subject is in good light, you can track focus even at f1.8 on a gimbal as the subject walks, which is pretty cool. And you can get a really shallow depth of field look on a gimbal with this lens. Most gimbal shots are the ultra wide kind, you know, like the 10 to 18mm. You see that about 90% of the time, especially in lower budget productions. So you can kind of give a special look to your shot by throwing the background out of focus and zooming in and using this lens and tracking with your subject. Here's another lens I rarely use. This is the Rokinon 85mm f1.4. This lens can't focus very close to the subject, but this one, the 50mm f1.4, can. 85mm is a very flattering focal length for faces. So if I did a whole lot of like fashion or something, I might use this lens a lot more. Now we get to my super zoom lens. This is the Sony 24 to 240 big heavy lens for full frame. It goes from 24, which is wide, to 240, which is definitely telephoto. It can cover basically all the focal lengths that you would practically use, but the aperture isn't constant and it's not particularly wide. Also, it is huge and when extended, very long, which means I can't use it on a gimbal. I mostly use this where I can't get very close to the subject. Here is the 24 to 70 GM lens. This is the G-Master series and it's huge. And I only would use this lens if I was covering a subject that was fairly close to me and I couldn't change lenses while shooting, like a wedding. Because if you're running around at a wedding and you want to get some wide shots and you want to get up close to people and get some close-up shots of them, this one is perfect. It gives you some nice shallow depth of field because it has a constant f2.8 aperture. You wouldn't really want to use something like a 24 to 240 for that kind of environment because the aperture on this is 3.5 to 6.3. And in a low light environment, you're going to be struggling and you don't really need to go up to 240mm for most of your shots. Finally, one lens that I neglected to mention earlier, the 16 to 50 kit lens for the A6300. This is effectively a 24 to 75 on full frame. And a lot of people kind of disregard this lens because they think it's cheap, it's not going to look good, it's not great in low light. But what it does have going for it is it's super small and it covers a lot of useful focal lengths. So it's great actually on a gimbal if you don't need super shallow depth of field and you want to keep your package ultra light and you want to pack it down easily when you're done. And another little bonus is that it has a servo zoom, which can be controlled either with your finger here, or you can use an app to control it. So if you're ever in a situation where you can't get to your camera and you want to zoom it, this lens is a pretty decent choice. So I'm going to close by answering a question that I get a lot, which is, if I could have only one lens with me, what would it be? And I actually have to give two answers to that. If I'm doing an artsy shoot, if I'm focusing on people's faces, if I'm doing something that's going to be in slow motion a lot and I want an ethereal sort of look to the shoot, 50mm f1.4 stays on the camera. I've done entire shoots with this one lens only and they look great. If I'm doing a photojournalistic shoot where I'm focusing on wide landscapes, if I'm focusing on capturing an unpredictable event where there's lots of action happening all around me, it's the 10 to 18mm. These two lenses put together can cover about 90% of my needs. I hope you found this useful, and come back next time.